Welcome to the 2022 Pierson Curtis Lecture. My name is Alicia Brumler, and I teach 7th grade English, literature, and writing here at the school. This year marks the 39th Pierson Curtis Lecture. The series began in 1983 and was sponsored by Bruce Lockerbie, a former SBS English teacher, and the English department. The goal of the Pierson Curtis Lecture series is to give students a taste of scholarship that they will encounter beyond the Stony Brook School by bringing university professors and accomplished professionals to campus to speak in depth about one of the disciplines that was embraced by Pierson Curtis. PC, as he was known, served the school for 44 years as a scholar woodsman. His knowledge of English literature, his ability to make Latin interesting and understandable, and his acuity with mathematics were balanced by his interest in woodlore and camping. From 1924 until his retirement in 1968, he gently yet firmly led generations of boys along the path to manhood. We're pleased to have the lecture series return after a several-year hiatus. In the mid-2000s, I was teaching at a school in Waco, Texas, when I first heard of Gary Schmidt. I was reading Wednesday Wars with my students. Little did I know that someday I would move to Long Island, where the novel was set, and even more delightful that I would come to know the book's author. In 2018, I met Gary while attending the Festival of Faith and Writing at Calvin University, where he teaches. What immediately impressed me about him was his kindness and his humility. At the time, we discussed the possibility of having him come to Stony Brook to speak. We just didn't know that there would be a pandemic that would disrupt those plans. Tonight, I'm honored to introduce to you Gary Schmidt. Gary teaches at Calvin University, a place that he has taught at for almost 4 decades. He teaches medieval literature, upper-level writing classes in fiction, and children's and young adult literature. He is the author of some 50 books, ranging from critical studies of the writer Hannah Adams, the first American to earn a living by the pen, and The Image of the Mouth of Hell in medieval literature and art, to novels for young adult and middle grade, to picture books for young children, to folk tales told during the Holocaust. For these, he has won 2 Newbery Honors and a Prince Honor, and was a finalist for the National Book Award. He is currently working on a collection of short stories focusing on minor superpowers. I'm anxious to see how that's going to turn out. Another collection of short stories set on the Jersey Shore, and a sequel to the novel entitled Orbiting Jupiter, and a study of writers of color who published for American young readers before 1965. His books have been translated into Japanese, Chinese, and Korean, Danish, French, Russian, and Hebrew. The Wednesday Wars and Lizzie Bright and the Buckminster Boy have been adapted for the stage and presented in such places as the Minneapolis Children's Theater and DePaul University, as well as Moscow. He grew up in Hicksville, Long Island, and graduated from Gordon College, taking a doctorate at the University of Illinois, and he now lives in a 200-year-old farmhouse in Alto, Michigan, spending as much time as he can on the repairs of the surrounding barns and the house that is required of a 200-year-old house, and he is accompanied in these chores by his border collie. Please join me in welcoming Gary Schmidt.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And first things first, thank you for all of you who I've met and you've been so kind. And it's been such an amazing, amazing day to watch you in your school, to see the things that you're doing. It's so encouraging on so many different levels. So thank you for that. Last year, a year ago in May, I was at a graduation in a very different place. It was at Hanlon Correctional Facility, which is a maximum security prison for men, where I've been teaching on Tuesday nights for the last several years. It is a maximum security prison. It takes about 45 minutes to an hour just to get through the security. You cannot believe the sound of a gate that closes behind you. Most of the guys I teach are lifers. They were graduating that day, that last May, into an associate's degree. I began to work at Handlin at this prison because of a guy named John Rotman, who was a chaplain at the prison. The year before, I'd lost my wife to cancer, and between then and the day that he called, I had canceled all speaking, I had stopped writing, I didn't do anything like we're doing tonight. There just didn't seem to be a whole lot of point to it. But John called and asked if I would come to the prison to speak to 28 guys who had read some of the books. I told him, no, I'm not doing this anymore. And John, because he is a wise and devout guy, said, Gary, it's been a year. It's time to get back in the game. I was furious. I was beside myself with anger. I couldn't believe he had said that to me. But I also trusted him, and so I went. I sat through the orientation at the prison, which is filled with incredibly dire warnings. Never turn your back on these guys, I was told. Never let them get behind you. Never let them touch you. Never touch them. Never use anything but their last names. Never let the panic button that you must wear by law, never let that leave your side. After all that, I was, as you can imagine, not all that thrilled to be going into the prison. But on a cold January night, I did go. The guys, as it turned out, were all late. They had been in lockdown all day because the guards had been finding so many knives. They'd spent the day in their underwear, and supper that night had been a piece of bread with a piece of American cheese on it, along with a swath of mustard. That was it. When I heard that, I thought these guys are going to come into the room with me mad as all get out. But when the first guy came in, his name was David, when the first guy came in, he looked at me and he said, "You can't believe what a blessing it is that you're here tonight." That's what he said. It's the first thing a lifer had ever said to me. You can't believe what a blessing it is that you are here tonight. The talk was supposed to go on for 45 minutes. It went on for 2 hours until one of the guards banged his baton on the glass and made us leave. And as we were getting ready to leave, one of the guys, his name was John Shank, no kidding, Shank, he asked, "So, how often do you ever read the Bible?" I was kind of surprised. It's not so often that you're asked by a guy in prison how often you read the Bible. And I decided that I would be honest. I told him about Henry David Thoreau, who on his deathbed was approached by a Concord minister, according to the story, who said this to him, "Henry, have you made your peace with God?" And Thoreau replied, supposedly, "I wasn't aware that we quarreled." Then, after I told him that story, I said, "Let me tell you about Anne," but I couldn't even do it. As it turned out, though, the chaplain John had already told them that I'd lost Anne a year ago, and they knew. And I said, by way of explanation to their question, "God and I have quarreled." And they looked at me in perfect understanding. We all in that room knew what it was to quarrel with God. We'd all done it. Some of us were still doing it. But these lifers were not done with amazing me. "We have something for you," said John. And I was a little surprised again. What could they possibly have for me? For me? I mean, really, what could it possibly be? And there were no guards in the room. It was just me and these guys. They all come to the front of the room. They all surrounded me, front and back. They're all touching me. And meanwhile, that panic button that I was supposed to wear, I was ashamed to wear it. I thought it would make me look afraid. And so I left it in my coat on a table on the other side of the room. But they were all around me, and you know what they gave me? They prayed. They prayed for me. These guys, these murderers and rapists and drug dealers who would never leave this prison, They surrounded me and held me, and they prayed for me. You cannot know what it is like to have a murderer pray for you because you've lost so much. The next day I called up John Rotman and told him, I'll do this. I'll be part of this program. One of my students was Anthony. The students I taught were in the enhancement class. That meant that these were students who were not able to be in the college class because they didn't have the skills. They wanted to be there, but they lacked the reading and writing and critical skills to succeed in a college classroom, mostly because of years of abuse and mostly because of completely neglected education. In that class, Anthony could read kinda, a little bit. He could write kinda, a little bit, but not even vaguely, not even anywhere close to what he needed to be to get into the college class. In the class itself, during the days, he never spoke. Even if I asked him something directly, Anthony would never speak. But he worked like a dog. He's desperate to learn. He was desperate. And he was desperate to figure out this sort of faith and learning stuff that we were talking about, which was completely new to him. Here's the world that Anthony comes from. When he was 9 years old, Anthony left his apartment early in the morning in the projects of New York and went to make a drug deal for his parents. When he came back to the apartment, they took the drugs and they went into their bedroom and they closed the door, and he knew he would not see them again the rest of the day. So, since he's not going to see them again, he decided he'd not go to school and just take the rest of the day off. And he sat down and he put on the television. And when he did, the picture that came up was the first burning tower. It was 9/11. He watched fascinated. He's 9 years old. And then he saw the second plane hit. Anthony went outside the apartment building and he looked up into the skies for the next plane that might hit his apartment house. He was writing this in a memoir for the class, and I thought after reading that line that he went out to see if there was a plane to hit his building. I thought after reading that must be how it was in New York City that day, that people must have gone out into the streets to see if there was another plane that was coming that might hit their building. That wasn't what Anthony was writing, though. Instead, Anthony wrote this, and this is his line now. I went outside to see if another plane was going to hit my apartment building. I wish there would be. It would do me a favor. He was 9 years old when he was wishing that would be. At the end of the first semester together, he came up to the front of the classroom and he quietly said to me, we read 11 books. Yeah, 11, I said. I was just glad to hear him talk. That's more books than I've read my entire life, he said. That's terrific, I said. And it was. Then he waited for a moment and he said this. If I had had these books when I was a kid, he said, then, and he didn't finish. If I had had these books when I was a kid, then, I think everyone in this room can fill in the rest of that sentence. A year later, Anthony stopped me one night in the prison hall to tell me he'd been accepted into the BA program. I know, I said, this is fantastic. He was overjoyed. I'm the first person in my family to get into college, he said. And you know what? I did it while I was in prison, which is kind of impressive. The year after that, I was passing through the security and I was walking down the long hall toward class on Tuesday night, and two prisoners who I did not know stopped me. Did you hear about Anthony? They asked. In a high-security prison, that question, did you hear about, is almost always followed by something horrible, some great disaster, and my heart stopped. Did you hear about? But it wasn't disaster this time. It was about Anthony's philosophy class, how his professor had returned written essays to his class, but kept Anthony's to the very end. How his professor had told the class that Anthony's paper was a model piece of academic writing. How the professor had then stopped the class and read Anthony's entire essay aloud to everyone else. In prison, being singled out like that can get you beat up to within an inch of your life. But these two guys, they were telling me this, they were proud of him. They were all proud of Anthony. That night, they nicknamed him Turtle. I have no idea why, but he goes by Turtle even now. I cried that night driving home as I cried after every class I've ever taught at that prison. Anthony remains there, and he will be. He's not the man, however, that he was when he had committed his crime. Since that crime, which is now over 12 years ago, he has not seen his 2 children, who were babies at the time. Last November, they were supposed to come to the prison to meet their father for the first time. But at the last minute, their mother refused to bring them. Anthony, even now, is still waiting to see them. And he said to me recently, I'm trying to work on that so that I can be what I'm supposed to be. So I can be what I'm supposed to be. Meanwhile, he says, he's reading all the time. Guys, fiction can only work, can only exist in a world that is broken. That's why we tell it. Fiction exists only in a world that's broken because it addresses specifically a world that is broken. That is its mission. That is its purpose, its strength, and its beauty. Fiction depends entirely on a mix of goodness and pain. You cannot write fiction in Eden. There's nothing to write about. It all depends on conflict, and there's no conflict in Eden. To read or to write fiction is to admit to and to indulge in brokenness. And to indulge in brokenness is to acknowledge our own. Maybe all art, on some level, does this, portraying the beauty of the world and the world's grief. My own family was a collection of storytellers, though on my father's side, they were a collection of uneasy storytellers. Like many German families, their stories always began at World War II, the immigrant years before them being the years we do not speak of, mostly because of the uncomfortable relationship with Germany. I heard almost nothing about my father's childhood, or about his father's life, or about my grandfather's life. The stories I did hear were always sort of truncated. I remember tidbits of the story of my great-grandfather renouncing his Prussian citizenship and then skedaddling off to America since he had to be outside the country's borders within 24 hours after signing this document. I heard just the beginning of the story of my grandfather walking across the street to his parents' home in Flushing, New York, in 1939, just after the invasion of Poland, and of him taking down the pictures of his father's nieces and nephews, many of which were still wearing their Hitler Youth uniforms, and my grandfather announcing to his father that that side of the family was dead to us now. I remember my father talking about a kid on their block who answered the call to return to Germany to fight in the German army, and whose mother, now still on the block but left alone by her only son, lived with drawn curtains forever afterwards. When that guy was killed, no one on the block knew how to comfort her. How would you? On my father's side, the stories of war mattered hugely. When we drove into New York City to visit Uncle Mal and Aunt Millie, my father and Uncle Mal would quickly move past my father's bank job and Uncle Mal's job as a librarian of the New York Philharmonic and get to what counted for them. Those days in the war, when Mal was in the Army and stationed on Guam, and my father was in the Navy and stationed on a supply ship. Here's a story that has stayed with me the best. Mal was responsible for knowing the current positions of all ships in the Pacific Theater. The officer above him once told him that if they were suddenly overwhelmed by the enemy, the first thing he'd do was to shoot Mal in the head. It was a joke, Mal thought, until he realized it wasn't. So one morning, Mal saw that my father's ship was coming in to resupply in Guam, and Mal decided that he would go meet him, as my father must have hoped too. On that day, they hadn't seen each other for well over a year. So Mal did everything he could to requisition a jeep, and when that failed, he stole a bicycle and began to cycle across the island of Guam, which is rather larger than you would imagine. Mal was not, and I'm being super kind here, Mal was not an athletic man. When I knew him, I could hardly imagine him on a bike at all. Nonetheless, he cycled like a madman, he said, right across the island, and he finally came to a port on the eastern side, and he arrived at the docks just in time to see my father's ship heading out to sea. He was too late. He said that for the only time during the war, he stood on the dock and he wept. They'd often tell this story together, and then they'd look at each other and they would laugh like horses, just guffawing like horses. And then they'd stop. Afterwards, I used to think of Mal standing on that dock, watching the retreating ship. I'd think of my father, stationed in the forecastle, unsure that Mal had even known he was on the island, wishing he had known he was on the island. I thought of Mal biking back across Guam, alone and lonely, all that way for nothing. Even as a kiddo, I knew that that story was an emblem, for me at least, of what it meant to be apart, what it meant to be lonely, what it meant to be cut off by large circumstances that you were not responsible for, and yet which controlled you completely. I guess it was a story that seemed, even for me as a young kiddo, to epitomize what it means to be mortal. On my mother's side, things were more writerly. My uncle's name was Bradford Ernest Smith, and I am suspecting that no one here knows that name. But some of you, who are as old as me perhaps, may know his work. Before Sesame Street, there were a number of live television shows. Remember when television was live? Shows that were aimed at a child audience, and one of those was Captain Kangaroo. Anyone know that one? Captain Kangaroo. My uncle wrote that show. He wrote it for many years, in fact, and it was on at CBS. It extended for, guys, 6,000 performances over 29 years. It was a pastiche of cartoons and music and skits and educational bits, all featuring Captain Kangaroo, who wore something like a naval uniform and had a mustache and a bowl haircut. And he was, to use a kind of out-of-date term, jolly. His companions were Mr. Green Jeans, who was an actor who presented as a kind of hayseed farmer, and Mr. Moose, who was a puppet with outsized moose antlers and was always a sort of step or two behind the joke. And there was some other kind of animal in costume. His name was Cosmo, who had a large round mouth but who never spoke. I have no idea what kind of animal he's supposed to be. The shtick that played on most of the shows was a tremendous shower of ping pong balls that came down at the moment of some crisis in all the skits. And I used to wonder as a kiddo how the captain and Mr. Green Jeans would ever be able to pick up hundreds and hundreds of ping pong balls that were falling from the set and have them ready for the next show. You can't believe how much cachet there is when I was in kindergarten and first grade and second grade that I could say, yeah, my uncle wrote Captain Kangaroo. You can't believe how cool that was. You also can't believe how little it was cool when I was in high school. But those early days were really nice. I remember a show when the captain came on to tell us that one of the minor characters who appeared from time to time had passed away. That is, the actor who played that character had died. I was a little older then, and I remember thinking how easy it would have been to have someone else play that character. How simple it would have been to eliminate, he was a minor character, just to eliminate him from the show. But Captain Kangaroo, who was crying, live television, came on to tell the children who were listening to the story about this actor's life, about his work with the show, how he had gotten ill, how he had died, who he had left behind. The captain talked about sadness, about his sadness, but also about how the day would come when Mr. Moose would be back on, and the ping pong balls would fall again. I felt as a kid respected. I felt that I was being told a very important story by someone who trusted me to understand why that story was important. It's not just another skit that I could eat while I'm eating my Lucky Charms. When I think about why it is that stories move us, when I think as a writer and a reader and as a teacher, I begin there with stories about my own past and what they gave me, what they still give me. Stories, good stories, provide what Aristotle called recognition. And though when he used that term, he was speaking about characters in which we see portions of ourselves, I think it is still within the framework of his thought to expand that to a recognition of the nature of the world. Stories move us in that we recognize in them what the world is like. Aristotle suggests that our response to a story should be, that's how it is. And when we respond that way, we're not just merely affirming an action of mimesis, of imitation. We're affirming the powerful community of a writer, or a teller, say, and a reader, who in that moment of connection are looking at the world together, not at each other, together. Perhaps they're affirming, perhaps they're denying that this is the way the world that we live in is. But nonetheless, at that moment, they're staring at the world together in perfect communion. This does not mean that we're all going to come to the same response about a story. As individuals, we see the world differently from each other, which is a good thing. There's no surprise with that. But I do remember how often, particularly in my teen years, again, no surprise here, I was particularly surprised at how different my perceptions of the Bible stories I heard told were from those perceptions of the loving teachers who instructed me in the old Quaker meeting house where we held Sunday school. I remember arguing with Mr. Skula, who was the cool teacher. He was the teacher that let us drive his tow truck around the town. We were 12 years old. It was great. It was fantastic. No kidding. When we talked together about the story of Lazarus, he could not understand how I saw it as a story about disappointment. He saw it as a story about restoration, about happiness. But it seemed to me so obvious that everyone in this story is disappointed. I mean, if the story tells us anything about the way the world is, if any story can do it, it's this one. So here's Jesus, who's just received the news that his good friend Lazarus is dying, who delays and delays and delays coming until his good friend is dead. Why? So he can display the power of God? It's pretty hard for Lazarus. And when Jesus finally does show up, why is it that Martha comes to meet him, not Mary? Is he surprised at that? He would have expected Mary, who's the closer one. And Martha's response to him at that first meeting is a killer. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, she says. Mr. Skula said this was a statement of faith. I said, no, she's ticked. She's angry. Lord, you know what? If you'd been here, jerk, my brother would not have died. And when Jesus finally gets to the house, even if he might have figured that at least Mary would have understood what he was up to, she doesn't. She's ticked too. And it's obvious they've been ticked together. She says exactly the same thing to her that her sister had said. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. It's an accusation. Jesus doesn't answer. But he goes to the tomb and stands outside. And here comes every kid's favorite verse. Jesus wept. If you have to memorize a verse, there it is. Why does he weep? Mr. Skula felt it was because Lazarus had died and he was sad. But I pointed out that Jesus must have known he'd be out of the tomb in just a second, thank you very much. Mr. Skula replied, no, he's crying for our mortality. And because I was a jerk and I just couldn't shut up, I said, you don't cry because of an abstraction. But really, why does Jesus cry? Well, I think it's pretty significant that there is no indication that Mary and Martha are with him at the tomb. Are his very closest friends disappointed in his complete failure to help? Or are they ticked that he's using them to make a theological point? His best friends don't get him, or his necessities, or his mission of sacrifice on our behalf, or even who he really is. In this story, Jesus is completely alone in the world. And in a moment, there's going to be all the acclamation of a great miracle, of course. But isn't he hurt that his closest friends have turned from him, that there's no faith, by their charges against him, by the loss of friendship? A man who is despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. He was fully human, as we are. He, like us, was acquainted with grief, acquainted being a polite King James Version word that doesn't begin to capture what grief is all about, that doesn't begin to hint at the loneliness that it drapes around the person who grieves like a cloak. Stories move us because they offer recognition. And in offering recognition, they insist that our humanity is communal. We recognize it in each other. John Donne is right. It really is true that no one is an island unto himself. Story will never accept that premise. Since this is a talk about story, and since I have you kind of trapped here, it only seems right that I should tell you one. And so I'm going to read you a story I wrote a couple of years ago for an anthology edited by a good friend who sort of knew that I needed the opportunity to write a story like this. Each of the writers was asked to write a work of fiction, so this is novelized in that sense. But it's based closely on something that actually did happen to them, and all of us had to do it in middle school. So with that as an introduction, let me just tell it and sit back and listen to a story. And the title of this is When She Whined in Her Sleep. On my first day of 8th grade in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow Junior High School, on his first day, Donnie Lentz got the draft notice that told him to report to camp down in Louisiana in 2 weeks. He would train for war for 30 days. After that, he'd be shipped to South Vietnam, where he would serve his country by joining the forces of the United States Army. Congratulations, the draft notice said. It wasn't like he hadn't expected it. He graduated from high school in June and had been bagging at the A&P ever since. He said he didn't want to start college and then have to leave like his brother had already done. I didn't know him all that well, since he was 5 years older than me and lived a couple of blocks away. We went to the same church, and if we saw each other there, he'd nod or wave or something like that, and then he'd go on to his pew and sit a little apart from his parents, like he was leaving space for his missing brother. He was the only one in the church who didn't carry a Bible in with him, and I think that rankled Pastor Jameson, since every so often he'd fuss about carrying your own KJV inside because you don't want Jesus coming back and finding you with a new Bible after all. It must have been frustrating for him to see Donnie walk in Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, Bibleless. I wondered sometimes if that was why Donnie did it. I mostly knew Donnie because he ran by our house every morning when I was leaving for 3rd grade, and then 4th grade, and 5th and 6th and 7th, and now 8th grade. He had this long, loping run with his head back and his mouth mostly open, his toes pointed to where he was going, his arms low and working like pistons. It looked kind of dumb. But his dog made up for it. She was a border collie named Mindy, and she ran down the street like she was running the hills of Scotland, parting the high grass in front of her, searching for lost sheep, her lips pulled back and grinning, her ears back, her mouth open just a little, running beside Donnie so easily, every so often looking up at him to be sure he was okay, which he always was. She had 2 different colored eyes, one blue, one brown, and when she pricked her ears up, the tip of the left one bent forward. Usually Donnie would just wave at me and keep on, but sometimes he'd stop, set his hands on his knees, breathe heavy, and ask how I was doing, how was school going, was I running, because I looked like I'd be a good runner, stuff like that. Mindy would sit beside him, watching me close, waiting for the least sign that he was ready to go again. She wouldn't take her eyes off him. Even when I rubbed the back of her neck or played with her tipped ear, she wouldn't take her eyes off him, even if I got down and scratched her chest. On our street, I never saw Donnie without Mindy. I think if he could have, he would have brought her to church too, which would have really gotten Pastor Jameson going. I knew Mr. Lentz too. He was the principal of Henry Wadsworth Junior High School. I don't know what it was like for Donnie to be a student in the same school where his father was the principal, since he'd graduated before I got there. But maybe it was easy, since everyone liked Mr. Lentz. He went to every basketball game and soccer match and football game, volleyball match and track meet. And he went to every play the Longfellow Thespians put on, and every concert the 7th grade choir, and the 8th grade choir, and the 9th grade women's chorale, and the 9th grade men's glee club put on. He knew our names. And sometimes he'd come and sit in the cafeteria with us. And sometimes he'd even eat the food. And sometimes he'd come in and read to us. And he'd do all the voices. He was that kind of a principal. The Sunday after Donnie got his draft notice, Pastor Jameson began his announcements with the news. It seemed like he and God were all excited about it. Donnie was being called to a great cause. He was going to be a small part in America's task of holding back communist atheism. He would bear witness to the light through the strength of his arms. Then Pastor Jameson went into an impromptu prayer, Like Joshua, may Donnie Lentz defend his people. Like Samson, may Donnie Lentz smite the godless. Like Gideon, may he lead others into battle for his Lord. I don't know how Donnie took all this in, since it was prayer after all, and Pastor Jameson was death on anyone who might look up for a glimpse. So we all kept our heads bowed and our eyes closed, I suppose. But I don't think Mrs. Lentz was all that happy about the draft notice. She and Mr. Lentz left after the last verse of Onward Christian Soldiers, and they weren't in the church vestibule when everyone was shaking Donnie's hand and telling him he'd be fine, and wouldn't it be good to see his brother again. And Mr. Ingmer told the old joke about remembering which was his gun and which was his rifle, and he'd better be careful with each one. And the old guys laughed, and Donnie looked embarrassed, and someone said he should remember to keep his head low, and then no one laughed. I didn't see him and Mindy running the whole next week. I looked for them, but they never showed. Until Saturday morning, when they came to my house and knocked on our door. And when I opened it, Donnie was standing on the porch, Mindy sitting beside him, watching him with those eyes, her ears up, her left one tipped forward. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I said. I told him congratulations. "Yeah," he said. I told him he must be pretty excited. I mean, going off to war, fighting in the jungle, all that stuff. "Yeah," he said. "Killing commies," I said. He looked at me. "Ethan," he said. "Another way of saying that is killing people." I told him I knew that. "A lot of people don't," he said. He reached down and played with Mindy's ears. "So, I have a favor to ask." "Yeah." "I wonder if you take care of Mindy for me while I'm gone." I looked down at Mindy. Taking care of her while he's gone? She was still staring at Donnie with those eyes. "Really?" "Yeah, really. She needs someone to run with her and play and stuff. And my folks aren't going to do that. I thought maybe you might like to." That night at dinner, I asked my folks about Mindy. I said I'd take care of her all by myself. I said she wouldn't be any trouble. I said I'd run with her every day. I said it was like a patriotic duty. This is called manipulation. I guess my mother thought so too. She started to cry and left the table. My father said I could take Mindy. Donnie brought her the morning he was going to leave for Louisiana. She was sitting beside him, and when I opened the front door, he put a leash on her, and you could tell she didn't like it one bit. She held it in her back teeth just beneath his hand, and every so often she'd tug at it, but her eyes never left him. "She's a good dog," Donnie said. "I know. And she's smart as anything. Whatever you say, she'll know what you mean." "I know. She's really well behaved, except she'll try to get up on your bed at night. Don't let her do that." "Okay. She knows she shouldn't be up there, but she likes to curl up in the covers." "All right. Don't let her." "Okay." He played with her ears. "She loves peanut butter. Maybe give her a little bit, some of it, every so often." "I will." "Okay. Okay, I'll take care of her, Donnie." "Okay." He handed me the leash, and immediately Mindy looked at me, her ears went down, she looked at Donnie, she looked at me again, and she gave this small whine from deep down inside her. He played with her ears a little more, and then he turned and walked away down the porch stairs. Mindy pulled once to follow him, but she knew. She lay down, put her head on her front paws, and watched him walk away. That whole day, if she was outside, I had to keep her on the leash. Otherwise, she would have run back home. When she was inside the house, she lay by the front window, watching. That night, she never even tried to jump on my bed, even when I told her she could. And I knew she was Donnie's dog. I knew that. But it changed everything. Somehow, when you know you have a dog waiting for you to come back home, it kind of puts junior high in perspective. I mean, a dog doesn't care if you get first or second or third seed in band. A dog doesn't care if you can spell efficacious, however. A dog doesn't care if Mr. Blue drives 60 miles an hour south while Mr. Green drives 45 miles an hour north, and how far apart are they after 20 minutes. A dog is just waiting for you to come home and run. I'm not sure Mr. Lentz cared all that much about Mr. Blue and Mr. Green either, because whenever I saw him in the halls of Longfellow Junior High, he only asked about Mindy. "She behaving?" he'd ask. "She's great," I'd say. "We appreciate what you're doing," he'd say. "Thanks," I said. "Tell Donnie she's fine. How's he doing?" And Mr. Lentz would nod, and he'd give a little wave and go wherever junior high principals go. For a while, Donnie wrote letters back to the church, and Pastor Jameson read them aloud during announcements. And then he would pray for Donnie smiting the communist peril, and he would pray for protection from the enemy, and he would pray that Donnie would return to the church, victorious when God's will had been done. And I would wonder if back home, Mindy was sitting by the front window, watching, praying her own doggy prayers for Donnie. I even wondered who God listened to more. She never watched me like she watched Donnie. She was always looking for him. We ran every morning and she watched. We ran every afternoon after I got home from school and she watched. We ran past Donnie's house, and sometimes Mr. and Mrs. Lentz would be on the porch like they were watching for us. And Mr. Lentz would give that little wave, and Mindy would run up on the porch and wag her whole hind end at them. She'd ask if Donnie was home yet, and they'd scratch her behind the ears, and she'd know, and she'd come back to me to finish our run. Mindy even watched when we turned on the 6 o'clock news, and we saw pictures of the soldiers fighting in Vietnam, and I learned that Pastor Jameson didn't know what the hell he was talking about. Mindy and I would sit together, and I would hold her, and I hoped she wouldn't see Donnie on the screen, not with what was happening to them there. Sometimes my mother would get up suddenly and turn the news off. Sometimes my father would use words about President Johnson that I never heard him say anywhere else. Then the letters from Donnie stopped, or at least Pastor Jameson stopped reading what they said. I wasn't sure which. And so almost a whole year went by, and who knew how many hours of algebra problems and social studies essays on foreign cultures and life science lab reports and book evaluations on To Kill a Mockingbird and 1984 and The Diary of Anne Frank and Flowers for Algernon, all done in the dining room while Mindy watched at the front window. And who knew how many hours of running with Mindy, enough so that late in the spring when Mr. Lentz saw me run the mile in PE, he was a PE coach too, he told me I should run cross country in 9th grade, and I told him I would. At the beginning of my last year of junior high, 2 things happened. First, we stopped going to Pastor Jameson's church. My mother said she'd had one too many smites preached at her. In the middle of a sermon about Jericho, she looked at me and she almost started to cry, and she took my hand and she said to my father, "We're done." And we left, right in the middle of the sermon, before the walls came a-tumbling down. And second, Donnie Lentz came home, but it was a few weeks before we found out. I think Mindy knew before I did. After a year, she had stopped looking out the front window. At least she didn't do it all the time. Now she sat beside me at dinner. She lay beside my bed at night. She followed me to the backyard and caught anything I threw: a frisbee, a tennis ball, a stick of wood, a biscuit. And I didn't need to keep her on a leash ever. When we ran, just like she and Donnie used to, side by side, with her looking up at me most of the time, and even sometimes jumping up and nipping at my butt, joking around like I was a sheep she was herding. Until one Saturday when she stopped when we got to the end of Donnie's block, looked down it, and sprinted to his house. She wouldn't stop, no matter what I yelled. She ran down the street, scooted across the front yard like border collies do, close to the ground, and so fast. Took the 4 steps on the porch with a jump and skidded with her back legs splayed out to the front door. So I rang the doorbell. Suppose she was right. But no one answered. Then I knocked because Mindy was watching and she wanted me to, and no lights came on, nothing. Even so, it took a long while before she came away, and after that, Mindy went back to watching out our front window. She knew. That wasn't how I found out, though, that Donnie was back. I found out when Pastor Jameson and Mr. Lentz knocked on our door one afternoon. I'd just gotten back from school, was getting ready to run with Mindy. She was eager. She was standing up on her toes the way border collies do, ears up, left ear tipped forward, grinning. Perfect day. Blue October, leaves starting to tilt towards new colors, high clouds, that dry smell of autumn. I was looking for my sweatshirt in the mudroom when I heard the knock and Mindy scooted to the door. Pastor Jameson was in a full-on suit, of course. He wasn't holding his Bible like he usually was, but he looked sort of stiff, maybe because we hadn't been coming since Jericho and things felt a little bit awkward. And I hadn't seen Mr. Lentz for a few days. Actually, when I thought of it, it had been a couple of weeks. "Hello, Ethan," he said. "She behaving?" "She's great," I said. I looked at Pastor Jameson. "Pastor, I'm sorry, but my parents aren't here." He laughed a little, sort of. "I've never done this before, but we're actually here to see her." He pointed to Mindy. "You're here to see Mindy?" "Ethan, Donnie's home." And I knew this day would come. I knew it. But I suddenly felt like I was either going to throw up or cry. I mean, Mindy was Donnie's dog. I guess I knew that. Of course he was always going to come back, and she'd be his dog again. I knew that. But for the past year, we'd run together like we belonged together. And it didn't matter so much if during the day there were jerks who do what jerks do in junior high, or teachers who didn't like you because they were in a bad mood because they hadn't had their morning coffee, or this girl who laughed when you asked if she might want to go out on Friday because there was this movie and you thought, but she never thought. None of that mattered, because Mindy was always ready to run. I loved her. I think Donnie needs his dog, Pastor Jameson said. Ethan, at night, when he's alone, the dreams he has, Mr. Lentz couldn't even finish. Minnie looked up at me. She knew. Okay, I said. I think that's what I said. Mr. Lentz looked down at me. I bet you meant the world to her this last year, he said. He reached down and rubbed her between the ears. I bet this will be hard as hell for both of you. I looked at him. I'm sorry, he said. It's okay, I said. No, said Mr. Lentz. None of this is okay. It was as hard as hell. We went for our run. It was longer than usual. We messed around when we got home. I took a long shower. I took a long time to get dressed. We played tug-of-war with my socks. I didn't try too hard to get them on. I found her leash and put it on, and she was not happy. She held the leash with her back teeth. I tried not to cry. As we walked the 2 blocks to Donnie's house, Mindy dropped the leash, and she started pulling. Then she was pulling really hard. Then we were on the front porch, and she was wiggling so much I could hardly take off the leash. I rang the doorbell. No one answered. I knocked. No one. You can't believe how hard it is to get ready to give what you love most in the world and then not have anyone there to take it. You can't believe how hard that is. But then the door jerked open, and Donnie stood there. Mindy went crazy. She jumped, she cried. She lay on her back with all 4 feet up. She whined, she jumped again. She ran around him, she nipped his butt, she jumped again, she cried again. And Donnie, he never moved. He never moved. He looked at me like he didn't even know who I was. He looked at me like I was standing away on the horizon, 1,000,000 miles away. Hey, Donnie, I said. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, he said, You shouldn't be here. What? But he didn't answer. At the sound of his voice, Mindy stood up on her hind legs and reached with her paws like she wanted to hug him. And with one quick move, he pulled back and smacked her on the side of her head, so hard that she yelped and skidded across the porch. Donnie, I said. Mindy crouched into herself. She put her tail low between her legs. She brought her head down. She crawled back. She turned her belly up to him. He kicked her square in the ribs. I knelt down over her. Mindy, it's Mindy, Donnie. Donnie, it's Mindy. Don't. And he closed the door. I heard it lock. And Mindy crept back down the porch stairs, her tail still tight beneath her, and she turned and she waited for me. I didn't need to put the leash on. That night, and for many, many nights afterward, Mindy slept on my bed. And when she whined in her dreams, I leaned down and I held her tightly. Oh, thanks. This is a story I actually don't read in public very often because it is for me not really a story about a boy and his dog. It's a story much closer to my own current life, actually. But I hope that there are some here, I imagine that there are some people here who recognize the emotions that this story is reaching, hoping to evoke or to capture or to recall. This is a story about coming to new understandings that hurt and disappointment have brought. It's a story about the pains of growing up. It's a story about the loss. We all know these feelings. Aristotle would say we recognize them. This is how it is. And when we see them, perhaps we can be allowing ourselves to be moved by them. Stories offer us recognition, and in recognition, we are, as readers, changed and moved. At least that's what the writer hopes for. But there is more. Several years ago, I brought a group of students up to Stratford, Ontario, to see plays as part of the annual Shakespeare Festival there. One of the plays is always a musical, which I confess I am never excited about. All that sudden breaking into song in the middle of a crisis is I always start to laugh. But we went to see The Man of La Mancha. On this trip was an English major who was very interested in theater. She also brought along her engineer boyfriend, who was not very interested in theater, but who was very, very interested in her. And he came along on that motivation alone. We do this trip on a very tight budget, so the tickets were, shall we say, the cheap seats around the edges of the theater. And it turned out that the English major and her engineering boyfriend, just randomly, got the tickets for the show at the very, very top of the festival theater. I mean, you almost need a telescope. The engineering major did not care, as he settled in beside her, fully aware of his motivation for coming, eager for the privacy that those seats way at the top are going to give. But the engineering major really did care a moment later when I came and sat down beside the two of them, because I had drawn the third ticket in the row. This was not, as you can imagine, a delightful coincidence for them. It was actually pretty weird for me, too. At the end of the play, after Don Quixote's adventures and misadventures, his family discovers him, and they force him to come home. And as he lies on what is clearly his deathbed, they try to force him to give up this ridiculous identity of Don Quixote, which he has assumed, and to speak, finally, his real family name. What's your name, they insist. What's your real name? Say it. And this engineering major beside me up in the seventh heaven of this vast theater, no kidding, he leans forward in his seat and he whispers to Don Quixote down on this stage, say Don Quixote. Tell him it's Don Quixote. And he doesn't. At that moment, the character yields, and he speaks his family name instead. This engineering major, he sits back with this terrible sigh of disappointment. I tell you the truth. At that moment, I would have done all the work that I had put into that trip for him and for him alone, so that he could be pierced with story as he was at that moment, so that he could experience that piercing, so that he could learn what art can do. And it doesn't matter that that musical, because it's a stupid musical, ends with Don Quixote standing up and eventually reasserting his imagined identity as Lord of La Mancha. This engineering major had already seen it, the terrible brokenness of a world without charity, imagination, or humanity. He had seen it, and he knew it was a true seeing, and he was changed. A few weeks ago, one of my students pointed me toward David Foster Wallace's book, This is Water, which I recommend highly to you. When Jacob, the student, told me it was short, I was sure he was mistaken, since David Foster Wallace had no idea how to write anything that was short. But he was right. It's very short. And it opens with this short anecdote, which perhaps some of you know. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys. How's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other, and he goes, "What the hell is water?" Guys, we live in a culture that is powerful and controlling and dominant and so insistent upon itself. And its greatest power comes from the fact that it doesn't announce itself. We hardly know it's there. We don't know we're swimming in water. It's so accepted and so unquestioned. Story tells us it's there. Story questions it. Story calls for us to wake up. Story tells us to pay attention. Story insists that we pay attention, because story often tells us what it means to live in the culture we live in and to see its effects. Jed Pearl's newest book, Authority and Freedom, A Defense of the Arts, he argues that the arts, that story, can move us so powerfully because they have the capacity to heighten and intensify experience. And this comes about when the artist and the viewer or reader are driven by what he calls an imaginative imperative. Or to put this in Henry David Thoreau's words, the arts have the ability to wake us up individually and collectively. And in heightening experience and in waking us up, story offers this possibility. we can respond more passionately, more wisely, more fully to the world around us, which is why the loss of a vigorous support for arts in the colleges and universities across North America, and make no mistake, the loss is incredible, why that is so frighteningly self-destructive. When our culture insists that we consume and consume and consume, when our culture preaches not self-reliance, but self-absorption and self-investment, when our culture focuses on the banal and the trivial, when our culture suggests that a story about a TikTok personality should be given the same level of significance and attention as a report on the loss of whole ecosystems, when our culture projects and protects a social media universe whose workings are, let's just say it, purposefully obscene and obviously destructive of communities and often manipulated to no good purpose, when all that happens, story begs us to pay attention to the individual and to the communal, to every complex and striving soul in our midst, like Anthony, who is loved by the Lord and shaped by the Lord and held in the palm of the Lord's hand against the onslaughts of a broken world. We see this in the ways that story offers us avenues of response. And I find that I am most moved by story. I am most moved by those that offer avenues, particularly when that avenue is one of grace. The Ethiopian writer Meron Hedero has a recent short story called The Suitcase. It tells of Saba, who has come to the city of Ababa to visit her relatives. She has brought 2 suitcases with her, one filled with what she needs over the next few weeks, the other filled with gifts from her American family in the States. It's a heady visit for Saba, as she opens channels between hard-to-bridge worlds, as she begins to understand and live in a country of her own family's history. That living is exciting and rambunctious and a little bit frightening, but Saba begins to get a sense of how important her heritage is to her. Her Ethiopian family sees this growth and this budding love, but they've seen this happen before. A relative comes, they enjoy a recreational stay, they go back to America, and all that it offers, and they never hear from that person again. They're sort of resigned that this is going to happen with Saba too. When it comes time to leave, Saba packs and then is asked to bring out the other empty suitcase so that her Ethiopian family can fill it with the gifts they want to send back to the States. The problem is, there is no way that all that they want to send back with Saba will fit into the suitcase. No way. No matter how they pack it or stuff it or manipulate it, negotiate the space, not everything's going to get in. So the question comes, whose gifts is Saba going to choose to take? Which, as you might expect, leads to huge fights over who gets to send their gift. And so time passes, and the time to leave for the airport is already passed, and now the tension in the air is huge. Can you guess what she does? This is from the story now. Saba walked to the suitcase she had packed herself, filled with her own things, and in one quick gesture she opened it and emptied the contents. Her best clothes fell to the floor, her favorite old jeans, most sophisticated dresses, her one polished blazer, a new pair of rain boots, T-shirts collected from concerts and trips and old relationships. She pushed the empty suitcase to the center of the room. "Dear friends, neighbors, relatives," she said in her forced Amharic, looking at the confused expressions that confronted her. "Please, now there's room for all." There were gasps, whispers, whistles, but no laughter. "Are you sure?" "It is the least I can do," she said slowly. "It is the least I can do." This is what happens when the arts come together with a world that is broken. This is what it is all about. This is why we read stories. So, let us end with this, a challenge to you all, for all the writers here who live in a broken world. Go home tonight and write the story of the woman who lives in Flushing, New York in 1944, who lives behind drawn curtains because her son has gone back to Germany and is regarded by everyone as a traitor. She lives alone. Her beloved boy, who spent his childhood playing with the kids up and down the block, has followed what he thought was his duty. He's gone back to fight on the German side. No one, this woman knows, thinks he is anything but a traitor. No one, she knows, thinks she is anything but a woman who is the mother of a traitor. And though she has not gone back, no one from the block now speaks to her. No one stops and knocks at her door. No one offers to help her carry the groceries. No one invites her to sit on the stoop with them as evening passes. No one. On Sundays, she huddles in the back pew of St. Paul's Lutheran, and she leaves before the final prayer so that no one sees her. And this morning, she got the telegram she has feared all along. It has announced her son's death while fighting for his country. And though there are gold stars in some of the windows up and down the block, there will not be one in hers. Write that story because you love the world the Lord has made, even in all its brokenness. And that is what writing is about. How does story move us? Why does story move us? That's how. And that's why. Thank you, folks. May the Lord God bless and keep us all. Thank you.
All right, before we dismiss, I want to open up the floor for just 2 or 3 questions. So a quick Q&A for Dr. Schmidt. I can't see anything, so you're going to have to frantically wave. Any questions for Dr. Schmidt? Want to start us off? Andy?
What is your biggest challenge when you write a story?
What is your biggest challenge when you write a story?
Yeah, voice. It takes me a long time to figure out what the voice of the narrator sounds like. And that means a lot of experimentation and a lot of tries. I work in a study that's outside the house and is heated with a wood stove. So I have a fire going on most of the time. And I work on a typewriter, not a computer. So I can bring pages in that are really awful and just burn them and be done with them. You can't believe how cathartic that is. Oh, this stinks. I'll just burn it. No one will ever see it. So it takes me a long time until I actually can feel like the voice of the narrator is working really, really well. And once it does work well, then the novel can start, or you hope that the novel is going to start well. The big example is a book called Okay for Now. I had finished one that was it was first person, and I decided that I did not want a first person book again. I wanted to wait for a while. I knew it was going to be a beat up kid. I think I tried for 2 months on that book, every day trying a narrator for a week, and it never worked, just never worked. And I did not want to connect it to any other book. But in the back of my head, there was this character from an earlier novel called The Wednesday Wars. And he was exactly the kid in a way that I needed. And there was a time, and it felt just like giving in, just literally like giving in, when I said, all right, dang, we'll let Doug try it and let him tell the story. And it sang. It just absolutely sang. I wrote a lot for me in that day. And that really was the beginning of the book. All the novels have been something like that, sometimes harder, sometimes not. But to find the narrator, that for me is the hardest part.
Yes, I can't see who you are. I'm sorry. Yellow shirt. Hey, Troy.
You really intertwine like history as well as storytelling so well together. And I just want to ask, were you like super into history? It's like maybe your family background stuff.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and you can't believe how often it was the case that I really, really wished that I had been a history major in college, and I wasn't. I went to college to be a lawyer, which I thought would be exactly what I wanted to do for a long time. I wanted to be in the Navy, and then I'm completely colorblind, so you can't go to Annapolis. Having that failing on me, I decided to go to be a lawyer. And I did finish the major in about 2.5 years. And then I have a whole 1.5 years in front of me. And so I thought, well, what the heck? I think I'll try an English major, because, you make a lot of money if you're an English major, right? And I loved it. I just absolutely loved it beyond all measure. And I thought, well, I wonder if I could possibly make this a profession. And so I came home at the beginning of my last semester, told my father I'm not going to be a lawyer. It was a most unhappy conversation, which he never forgave. He never really forgave that I didn't become a lawyer. And it actually happened on the Long Island Expressway, no kidding. We were driving along, and there was a set of condos being built on the north side of the expressway. And my father, who thought I'd be a lawyer and come back to New York, says, "Gary, someday you can live there." And I looked at that and I thought, oh, that looks like hell to me. That's not at all what I want to live in. And that led to the conversation that was really, really a problem after that. But no, I wish I had been. Because I'm not, it means that there's a lot of study to do for each one of those books to make sure that I get things right. And every so often there is an error. I won't tell you the big one. But now I look at it and I go, oh, dang, I wish I had gotten that right. But it just means huge amounts of study.
Last question, though. There are a lot. If you want to stick around after, feel free. I see back there a hand up. Oh, hey, Nate.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask, what are some college majors that you would suggest to someone who's just passionate about language? For me, I'm just passionate about the subject. I don't really know
Yeah.
where I want to go, but I'm just really passionate about it.
Okay. So was that colleges?
Yeah.
Where you might go?
He's saying he's really passionate about English. What do you do with it?
Oh, anything. And I'm not being facetious. I really do mean that. Any profession that calls for good communication skills is going to be an English major. Anytime that you're in a profession that takes a whole lot of material, a whole lot of information, and tries to bring it into a point where it's understandable in a coherent way is going to be an English major. Lawyers. I can't even tell you how many lawyers have said to me in the past, after I let them know that I was going to be a lawyer, they would say, I wish I was an English major, because so much writing is involved. My son is a lawyer, and he wishes he would have been an English major now. I don't know if that's just buttering me up. But it really is the case that any profession that requires good communication and writing is going to welcome you. And I really mean welcome you. You cannot believe how difficult it is to find people who are good writers. I mean, you just can't believe it. This very day, earlier today, I got an email from an editor at Oxford University Press. Oxford University Press, thank you very much. And I had fussed at her about this proposal that had been sent to me to evaluate. And I said, you know, you would imagine that a writer who's applying for or trying to get a proposal into the Oxford University Press would at least proofread. And I said, this sounds like a freshman rhetoric paper to me. And she writes back and says, you know what? 95% of the proposals I get are poorly written. It's Oxford University Press. If you can write, oh my gosh, anything.
But I would, on the last thing, just like to give one more round of applause for Dr. Schmidt and his time today.